Okay, so what we're doing here is I'm going to give you some background on this PowerPoint. I'm going to put online of Egypt, which will save us some class time to allow us to do some more fun things than just you listen to me talk. So you can listen to me talk in the comfort of your own home. All right, very convenient. So let's talk about Egypt for a minute. Um, First of all, let's look at the maps of Egypt. On the left here, we have the map of a bigger map of the Nile. And this isn't even the whole Nile. The Nile itself is 4,100 miles long. It begins down here in Lake Victoria in Central Africa and flows north up to the Mediterranean. There is snowmelt that occurs down here in Central Africa, in the mountains of Central Africa. That snow flows north in the form of a flood every spring. And you can see the green line here that follows the river up to this fan green area that flows out into the Mediterranean. And that's where the ancient Egyptian farmers would plant. We can still see that today. Now, on the left here, we have the actual kingdom of Egypt, which only exists from about here all the way up. And so this is the actual kingdom. The reason why the kingdom cuts off there is because there are rapids that exist below here, 3 to 4 rapids that they call cataracts, okay? And in the ancient kingdom, the cataracts was a natural border, because they were difficult to go over, of the Egyptian kingdom. Now, since the river flows south to north, the two regions of Egypt that we talk about are the upper and lower Egypt, right? Now, upper is not going to be in the north like you might think. Upper is actually going to be here in the south because it goes with the flow of the river. Upriver, downriver. So upper Egypt, lower Egypt. So upper Egypt is everything from the first cataract all the way up to the Nile, where the Nile Delta begins, where it fans out into the Mediterranean. Lower Egypt is going to be this area of the fan, of the delta that flows out into the Mediterranean. Okay? So upper is there and lower is there. Now, when the kingdom is united, then we'll have upper and lower Egypt together. Okay? Now, so that's the Egyptian kingdom. So in the ancient world, if you were going to travel up and down the Nile, it was actually relatively simple. If you wanted to go north, you would go with the flow of the river. So you just put your boat in the river and it takes you north all the way out into the Mediterranean. But if you wanted to go south, which would be against the current, luckily for you, the winds would blow from north to south. And so you could put your boat in the river here, put a sail up, and it would take you all the way down to your destination in southern Africa or upper Egypt. Okay? All right. Now, in the beginning, Egyptian mythology, and we'll watch a video of this in class, so you'll get part of this as well. The Egyptians believed, according to their mythology, that the world was made up of two gods. You have Nut, who is the sky, and Geb, who is the earth. And they were mates. They were in love with each other, but like in most of those stories, they could not be together. They were separated. But in her, her tears flowed down on Geb because she missed him, and Geb was fertilized by her tears, and plants sprung up. That's very sweet. Now, and so this was the Egyptian universe, right, with the stars in the sky representing Nut and Geb, the earth, and producing fruit. We have, you can see boats that go across the sky there with different gods. And so the Egyptian universe made up of the sky and the earth. All right? Now, Egypt was a polytheistic religion as well, so they had hundreds of gods. And as you probably already know, many of these gods represent human forms, but sometimes they have animal heads, right? So we'll get into that. The gods that you probably need to know, just to understand the culture of ancient Egypt, are these. Okay, two of the big gods are Osiris and Isis. Now, Osiris was god of the dead, and Isis was the mother goddess. So she was kind of the Inanna of the Egyptian culture, right? Now, at one point, they were husband and wife, but then a very long story that I might tell you in class, Osiris dies, and therefore he becomes god of the dead. You can see his skin is blue, which represented decay or death. He also is dressed in white, which is supposed to represent mummy wrappings, and so he's almost wrapped like a mummy. So he is the god of the dead. And Isis is the protecting mother goddess there, right? Now, the other three gods that we see here, this is Horus, okay, and Horus is important because Horus is god of the living. And so Osiris would be god of the dead, and he would represent and rule over the world of the dead. Horus is god of the living. He has the head of a hawk, and he would represent the Pharaoh himself, the the king of Egypt is also a god. In the book they call it divine kingship. I'll talk about a theocracy, right? So you also call it a theocracy. Now, he has an uncle, Osiris' brother, Set, who's the god of chaos, the god of evil. And there's kind of a story that we'll relate in class about how Osiris dies, it's Set's fault, and then Horus overthrows Set to become the new pharaoh. I guess maybe even the most important goddess that we have in all of this like soap opera that is the Egyptian gods and their stories is actually Ma'at. Now, Ma'at was one of the first gods created. She is important because she holds the balance of life and death, right? She is the feather of justice. And so she's almost unbiased in a way, but she's represented by the feather that we see on top of her headdress here. So we can usually recognize Ma'at from the feather that she has, and that's going to be important in the stories moving forward. Okay, so we know the Egyptians were very religious. We know they had hundreds of gods, and so they must have believed in an afterlife. All right, so this is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And the Egyptian Book of the Dead, if you've ever seen The Mummy, the Book of the Dead is the book you read and the mummy comes to life. Well, that's great. But it turns out that the Book of the Dead was one of the most published books in ancient Egypt. And it was published because it was what you needed to get to the afterlife. Now, when you died, your soul had to pass through lots of different trials and dangers and curses, and you needed all kinds of magical spells and helps and cheats, if you would, for the gamers out there, to try to get yourself to the afterlife. And that's where the Book of the Dead comes in handy. The Book of the Dead had all of those things, magical spells, things like that. Now, what we're looking at here is the last page of the Book of the Dead. Okay? And what we have to do is we have to look at this kind of as if it were a comic book, frame by frame. And so let me explain. Over here on this side, let's pretend that is you. You've died. Sorry about that. And you're being led into the room of where you're going to be judged by the god Anubis. Anubis has the head of a dog, and he is in charge of mummification and preparing the bodies and getting you to the afterlife. So he helps you out. So you go into the room, frame 1. Frame 2, here you are, but that is your heart. If you look really closely, that's just a red kind of dot thing. That's supposed to be a heart. Anubis is preparing the scales, right? The scales of justice. Over here is the feather representing the Ma'at, or the goddess that we just saw. And in order to get to the afterlife, your heart must be weighed against this feather, this Ma'at, okay? Now, if your heart was heavy with sin, then it would be heavier than the feather, and therefore you would fail the test. And your punishment is that you would be eaten by this beast here with the alligator head and the leopard body and the hippo butt. All the fat goes to its butt, right? Now, his name is Impepe, and Impepe would find your soul delicious, and he would devour it for all eternity. Now, that's the Egyptian hell. But let's say you're a good person, and your heart does not have sin, and therefore it is lighter than the feather, then you pass the test. The god of wisdom, Thoth, will write your name in the book of life, if you will, and then you, again, will be led by Horus, the god of the living, to meet his father, Osiris, god of the dead, so you can pass into the afterlife, right? So that was the last page of the book. So the question I'm sure is on your mind is, what's it like? Once you make it to the afterlife, what do you get? What do you win? Maybe you are swimming in money. Maybe you get to live in big houses. Maybe you have a boat in a private island. Well, no, not really. Let's say, for example, that you were a farmer, and you spent your life farming, and you were a very good farmer, and you were a good husband or a good wife, and you were good to your children. You were a good person. So you pass the test, you go through all the trials, you go through Osiris. Osiris welcomes you to the afterlife, and you are a farmer in the afterlife. That's what you do. Now, that might sound like a raw deal, but put it this way. You never get sick, never get old, none of your loved ones ever die. All the jerks are gone because they got eaten by the hippo beast, right? And every day is the best day you ever had. And that's Egyptian heaven. And so Egypt is truly a culture that is built on death, right? The idea is to be good in this life and make it as good as you can in this life so you can go to the afterlife and live a perfect life, right? And so Egyptians were constantly focused on death, which is why we see all of the big things they built, all of the temples, all of the art that they made is focused on death rather than life. Okay, so let's get back to the history. The first king, as we read in our book, that united the Upper and Lower Egypt was a king named Menes. Sometimes in history you will see him named Narmer. The book calls him Menes, right? Now we know he unified Upper and Lower Egypt because he combined the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. And so when we see him and other pharaohs from the Old Kingdom, we see them wear these crowns. Okay, so the crown of Upper Egypt is the bowling pin looking crown there. The crown of Lower Egypt was the chair that had the little funny thing coming out from it. You combine those two and you have the crown of Egypt. Right? Now this is the face of Menes. But what you need to understand about pharaohs, and maybe you've already noticed this by looking at statues of pharaohs, is that they all look the same. And you're right, they do. Because pharaohs were never sculpted the way they look. They were sculpted in a regular pattern that all pharaohs were sculpted in. And that's what they wanted. They didn't want to look like they looked. They wanted to look just like a pharaoh. So it's a plain face. Imagine that's a mask. And all pharaohs were represented by this mask, right? And Menes was the first one to be represented that way. So Menes combines Upper and Lower Egypt. Menes is the first pharaoh, and he combines the kingdoms. Now, it's important to note that he begins the first dynasty of Egypt. Now, a dynasty is a line of kings from the same family. The Egyptian kingdom lasts for 3,000 years, and in that 3,000 years, it has 31 different families, or 31 dynasties that rule over Egypt. Okay, now, one of the things about Egypt that we all know is the fact that they built lots of tombs. They loved tombs because they were focused on death, as we just learned. Now, the first type of tomb that we have here is called a mastaba. And the mastaba is simply kind of a tombstone, the early Egyptian tombstone. Mastaba is ancient Egypt for the word bench that you would sit on. And so this is all above ground. It's simply just a stone marker. It's larger than a regular tombstone. But as you can see here, this is more of a family plot. You can have individual plots, but you're actually buried underground. They have like a shaft that goes into the earth, and they bury your body down there. They build the mastaba around that. You can go in, and it's not a very big space, but you can leave offerings, right? And one thing that we know about Egypt is that they truly believed that when you died, you could take it with you. So anything important that you had, the Book of the Dead, you want to be buried with, any gold that you had or any treasure, anything special to you, you would want to be buried with. And it also was believed that on your journey, you needed sustenance and food. So your relatives, your loved ones would come and bring you food every now and then and just leave it there for your spirit to eat, right? And that's why we have these mastabas with these little spaces or these little hallways where your relatives can come and bring you food. So the first type of tomb we have in Egypt is a mastaba. Now, if you're important, you want something bigger than a mastaba. So we graduate to the step pyramid. Now, one mastaba becomes so big, and then they want you to be able to see it, so they put a smaller mastaba on top of it, then another one, and another one, and eventually you have a step pyramid. This step pyramid is the largest, and it was built by the pharaoh named Zoser, right? Zoser just stacked a bunch of mastabas on top of each other. His tomb is still underground, so this is a solid structure. It's not, there's no hallways or rooms in there like the big pyramids. And so he's still buried underneath the ground, but he just has this large step pyramid that represents his tomb. Now, eventually they wanted to make a true pyramid, right? They started by trying to fill in the steps to make the true pyramid. That didn't work. Egyptian engineers were very bright, and so they got together and they tried to build the pyramid. They were successful with the smaller ones, but when they tried to build a big one, this pyramid at Dashur, they built it up to a certain point, and then the architect realized that his foundation was cracking. So he goes to the pharaoh and he explains, your foundation is cracking, my king. And instead of tearing it down and trying again, they increased the pitch of the pyramid and went ahead and finished it, so it has this slight bend in it. So this is called the bent pyramid. And it's interesting from an artistic standpoint, so we can see the trial and error that it took to build the actual true pyramids, from step pyramid to bent pyramids to the actual pyramid themselves, which are these, right? So we have the Great Pyramids of Giza. One thing that's interesting is the step pyramid and the bent pyramid, you can see them from the Great Pyramid. They were all built around the same area. They're not in different parts of Egypt. You could drive to them, and all across the desert you can see them. So these are the three Great Pyramids. You have Khafre, you have Menkaure, and you have the largest one, which is Khufu. Okay, and they were all built during the same dynasty by three successive pharaohs. Now, this is Khufu's pyramid. It's the internal arrangement of the Pyramid of Khufu. This is the inside. What we've discovered at this point is that there are different shafts or hallways that flow up and down inside the pyramid. The large here you can see is the king's chamber. The queen's chamber is right there below. Now, we discovered this, and we don't find anything. There's nothing in there. No mummies, no bodies, no gold. So we assume that the large room is the king's pyramid, the small room is the queen's pyramid, but then we have the secret chamber down here. So who knows? Maybe the king tricked the grave robbers and was actually buried down here. Whatever the case is, once archaeologists got inside the pyramid, there was nothing left, right? What's interesting about this is that when we know that when the pharaoh was buried, whether he was buried here, we assume it was here because there were these large boulders that were slid into the hallway and just jammed there. And the archaeologists had to dig through them to actually get to the king's chamber. The first known people who got into the pyramid was an army that had come down like thousands of years after they were built. An army had come down and invaded Egypt, and the conqueror was like, I want to get inside. They couldn't find a door. So the way you enter the pyramid today is the way they entered it. They dug through the side of the pyramid until they hit a hallway, and then they went from there. And that's how we get into the pyramid today. So we really don't know where the door was, or even if they just closed up so there was no door, right? Okay, so the interior of the pyramid is really cool. You have this these high walls, and these. If you're able to ever go to Egypt and you're able to ever get into the pyramid, you follow the stairs all the way up to the king's chamber there. And I've seen documentaries where you can actually climb above the king's chamber to the workers area where they would like be working inside the pyramid. That's only for like famous historians that get on documentaries. But it's really cool. It's almost like being in a man-made cave. Here we have the Khufu behind there with the Sphinx. The Sphinx is, I think, the face of Khafre, right? Who put him? The Sphinx is a solid structure too. It's not. There's no rooms and things in the Sphinx. Okay. All right. So pyramids from above. One of the things about the pyramids, first of all, of course, it is a tomb, right? But second of all, it was meant to be and we'll talk about this in class. It was meant to be a propaganda of power. These buildings were supposed to show that the pharaoh had great power. Remember, we talked about the idea that what makes us human is to coordinate large groups and to be flexible and to believe fictions. They believed that the pharaoh was a god, and therefore thousands of workers came together and built these massive pyramids. Now, when the pyramids were completed, what we have to understand is that they were done and encased in white limestone. Right, the pyramids today are just kind of, you can actually climb the pyramids because they're just kind of blocks that are stacked on top of each other. When they were completed, there was a smooth white limestone. And on the top of Khufu's pyramid, they actually had a gold capstone, right? So you can imagine the brightness of the white limestone in the desert sun, and then the gold pyramid on top, on the capstone, that would actually flash in the sun to look like a light. And around all these, you can see, was a huge temple complex that went around all the pyramids. And so on religious days and holidays, we have to go through this maze of temples and columns and things to actually get to the pyramid itself. So it was pretty impressive. You went to the pyramids, or went to Egypt, you were pretty amazed by the power. And they're old. They're built a long time ago. When the pyramids were being built, there were still woolly mammoths roaming the earth, right? When we talk about the Moses story, and Moses' story was around Ramses, which is the New Kingdom. So if the Moses story happened when he gets to Egypt, the pyramids are already 1,000 years old. And so they were ancient structures, right? And they show the power of the Pharaoh. Second of all, the pyramids were tombs, of course, but they were special tombs, right? Tombs that were supposed to send you straight to the afterlife without having to go through any of the dangers and trials of an underworld, but you just went straight there since you were the Pharaoh. And we believe, and you can see this from the satellite photo of the pyramids, that the Egyptians were, on top of being great engineers, they were also great astronomers. And these astronomers would be able to look at the stars, and they aligned the pyramids to match up with certain constellations, namely Orion's Belt. If you're familiar with Orion, Orion's Belt is the three bright stars in the sky. Orion is the hunter. Of course, the Egyptians didn't know it as Orion. That's more of a Greek thing. And so the three pyramids here would, at certain times of the year, line up with the belt of Orion. And some astronomers, some historians believe that the Egyptians did that on purpose because there was a spiritual connection with those stars that would allow the pharaohs to leave their pyramids and go straight to the heavens. Okay, now, so that's the basics of death and the afterlife in Egypt. And when you watch this, I want you to like maybe take notes if that helps you, or just remember the idea and use it with the class notes that we take to help on our test coming up. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you later.